129th day of class, the Great War, World War I. And I'm fully aware that you've already learned about World War I in your U.S. history class, so I hope today is more of a refresher and a reminder than it is new material. And World War I was thought of by some as the war to end all wars. It was so destructive, so vicious, so brutal, that there is this notion that humankind would never fight again. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But starting off, I want to teach you how to fish, then give you a fish. And I've seen this over the years. If you're presented with something like this, if I were to start off my first slide with this, I'm going to guess a good fraction of you would shut down. You'd be saying, oh my goodness, there are 6 boxes and this font, and there's a lot to process in one slide. And I've seen people shut down. Now, if you are ever presented with something like this, I would hope you are proactive and ask the teacher or professor and say, hey, can you simplify this for me? Can you break this down in a way that I understand? So instead of shutting down, you will be engaged. So here's my attempt to simplify matters. M.A.N.I.A. These are the 5 letters I need you to know as the causes of World War I. And the first, the M, is militarism. And militarism is this buildup of military equipment. And it's human nature when you get a new phone, or you get a new video game, or you get a new anything, every cell in your body wants to use it. And with these nations getting these new military items like machine guns and tanks, they're going to want to use them. And then another thing happens. If the country next to me has this military equipment, I better get this military equipment, and then it starts spreading, and everybody gets this military equipment, and that becomes militarism. The A stands for alliance, and it's another piece of human nature. If you are connected to somebody, if you are friends with somebody, if you are tight with somebody, and somebody goes after them, you have their back. I've seen it in school hallways, I've seen it in geopolitics, but it's this notion, if you have a friend, you look after your friend. And during this time, this network of friendship and alliances, very complicated, very tricky, and it just spread and spread and spread. Now, nationalism, from the last unit, this belief that we have a new identity as a country, and that we think our country's pretty good, and that we are going to flex our muscle to show the world who we are. And this was going on. So that's the N, nationalism. I is imperialism. Big nations trying to profit, I shouldn't say trying to, successfully profiting off of other nations. But at the core of imperialism is greed. And if a person's getting a bigger piece of the pie, you're going to want to get in on that. So you have all these nations, and I understand last unit at the Berlin conference, there was an attempt to make sure they didn't step on each other's toes. Eventually, they step on each other's toes and want to get more of those imperialist dollars. So that's I, imperialism. And the A is assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the analogy I gave, an enormous fire. And I remember as a kid, we used to have these bonfires the night before the homecoming game. Huge. You know, wooden pallets, the whole, and monstrous fires. It was started with just a little Bic lighter. So this was the flame that ignited the bonfire, and it caused people, all these alliances to kick in. This notion, my country's better than you, and I'm going to use these new weapons that we've acquired. Put it all together, M.A.N.I.A, the causes of World War I. And eventually, it turns into a brawl. And the difference between a fight and a brawl, a fight's between 2 people. It's settled quickly. A brawl is when people jump in. And I would say World War I is most definitely a brawl. Many players, but there were 3 fundamental choices. You were either on the side of the Allied powers, and we can see here France, United Kingdom, Portugal, Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Russia. But the big players, Russia, UK, France, and America eventually in 1917. And these Allied powers were versing the Central Powers, primarily Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And some people stood out of it. And you can use some logic. If you see a brawl going on, and this brawl has nothing to do with you, it's probably best just to walk away and get out of the mix. And you can see the Scandinavian nations and Spain stayed out of the mix. So these are the basic sides. And I think this cartoon illustrates very well the way people were feeling. That it was almost this notion that Western civilization is crumbling. It's kind of end of the world stuff here. And this building, symbolic with Greece, because Greece is the foundation of Western Civ. Here's war taking out culture, finance, commerce, industry, civilization collapsing on itself. And again, that match that lit that bonfire, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. This got things going, and it got ugly. And again, to reiterate my point, it turned into a brawl. Okay, they had the Allies versus the Central Powers, and it was on. It was on big time. Now, initially, the U.S. said, "Hey, we're staying out of this. You know, heck, this is off in Europe. Why are we going to get into this mix?" And you know, as Wilson said, remain neutral in thought as well as deed. You know, if we look back on history, we can understand why he did that, but it changed up. First of all, we get the propaganda. You know, it's hitting the people's emotions that maybe we need to get involved. We see the rest of the world having this new equipment, machine guns and tanks and artillery. That's scary. You know, if other people are acquiring these weapons, we start thinking, well, we need to probably get them ourselves. And probably most important, these three things. The Russians pulled out of World War I. And to give the analogy in baseball, there's a starting pitcher and a relief pitcher. Now, if you're not familiar with baseball, there's 9 innings. Starting pitcher goes out there, pitches 6 of them until their arm can't go anymore. And then they bring in a new pitcher for the last 3. They call that pitcher the relief pitcher. And if they do well, they save the game. Well, Russia was the starting pitcher and America was that relief pitcher. And we didn't save the game. We saved the war. And the Russians getting out, America felt a need. Also, the Zimmerman note. The Germans, real sneaky, tried to get Mexico to attack us from the south, and we intercepted this. And again, if you find out that somebody's coming after you, and you have proof of that, you gotta knock them down a peg for doing such a thing. And America felt compelled to do that. And then we started losing money from our shipping losses. And again, you mess with your money, that's a problem. So these 3 things got America into the mix. So I want to look at a primary source here. I want you to observe, reflect, and question. Observe, reflect, and question. And looking at this, what I observe is not a place I'd want to be. You can see the ground is that wet mud. If you ever ran in wet mud, it's hard to get your footing. And it's carrying this heavy equipment in the mud. This used to be a lush, beautiful forest. It looks like, I don't know what it looks like, Halloween or something. It's messed up. And again, if you are going across no man's land here, the people have the crosshairs on a standing target. I don't know if this guy is long for this earth. And in terms of reflection, wow, should America have gotten in there? What kind of bravery do these men have to have? Did they even know what they were fighting for? What was their train of thought? You know, I don't know. And in terms of questioning, I have some questions. How many men died? What country is this? Where in the world are they fighting? What was the outcome? So we talked about that in class, and the picture does say 1,000 words. And in terms of men killed in battle, you can just see it was a horror show across the board. And more people died of disease than they did by bullets, but it was a horror show across the board. And in terms of casualties, 20 million people lost their lives in World War I. And this is a rough estimate. I've heard as low as 16. I've heard as high as 25. So we'll go with 20 million, give or take. We're not exactly sure. That's how many people died. And if it can't get any worse, after the war, we get the Spanish flu that kicked in that killed another 20 million to 50 million people. It's the deadliest 5 years in human history at that point in history. So if you had this notion it was kind of end of the world stuff, I get it, because these 5 years between World War I and the Spanish flu, horror show, and you see the Spanish flu just decimating people. They would find a dance hall or an airplane hangar, any big space, try to keep the people, but they were dying faster than they could get beds. And worst pandemic in centuries. I mean, absolute destruction. I mean, we remember bubonic plague, and we learned about malaria and some of these other calamities in human history. This is as bad as it gets. A pandemic on a scale that's hard to even wrap your mind around. But, it gets worse. Yeah. After the war, they gather at the Versailles Peace Conference, Treaty of Versailles, and I'm going to call it, in my opinion, one of history's worst mistakes. And the reason why we screwed up. I mean, we exclude Russia and Japan. So let's anger 2 countries that contribute, especially Russia, who really did the heavy lifting, but we exclude them. And then Germany, let's humiliate them. Let's make them broke. Let's rake them over the coals. Let's embarrass them. Now, by comparison, you take the American Civil War. Once that was over, President Lincoln said, with malice toward none, let's reconstruct for 12 years. At this point, I can go down south and it's okay. Because after a battle, after a conflict, you need to get people back to some normalcy. Treaty of Versailles did not allow Germany to get back to any normalcy. And then Wilson had a proposal of 14 points. And I'm going to argue this is a very reasonable way of thinking. He wanted to make the world safe for democracy. And points 1 through 5, to summarize, international laws, things that everybody should follow. Torture, chemical weapons. I think we all can agree, don't torture, don't use chemical weapons, things of this nature. 6 through 13, let's restructure the boundaries so people aren't going to have that tension. To give you, to scale it down, I make a seating chart. If I had two people that hated each other or had a conflict with each other, I'm going to put them on other sides of the room to try to lessen conflict. That'd be a real bonehead not to. And that's essentially what Wilson was saying. And then League of Nations, hey, let's talk it out before we fight. Didn't stick. Now, the UN a few years later did, but as of now, didn't stick. So, between all this, after 20 million casualties, 50 million Spanish flu deaths, failure of the Treaty of Versailles, and a global Great Depression, we get the sequel in 1939. We have the Second World War. And I want to pose a question. If the Treaty of Versailles was done better, if it was done more thoughtfully, if the 14 points would have stuck, could we have avoided the calamity and horror show of evil that we saw in these fascist regimes in Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy and Franco's Spain? Food for thought, but unfortunately didn't work out that way. So this was a dark chapter in our history, and I appreciate you watching.